The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, I'm Mark Mather with PRB. I help manage the ACS online community website and some other activities in partnership with the U.S. Census Bureau. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar on understanding the new ACS, this American Community Survey, summary file format. We have two experts joining us for the webinar today. Matthew Key, who is an IT specialist from the ACS office at the Census Bureau. And then we have Jonathan Schroeder, who is a research scientist at the Minnesota Population Center. So Jonathan is here to kind of provide a data user perspective on the new summary file format. Just a couple of notes before we start. We're going to save the questions till the end just to make sure we get through the presentations. But if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the question box on your webinar control panel. And you can do that at any time during the webinar. And then if we do have some extra time at the end, I think we could invite some data users to stay on to talk more informally with the panelists and have just kind of a more informal conversation if you have any more detailed questions you'd like to ask them. This webinar is being recorded, so if you need to leave early, you will be able to access this recording online later. We will also provide, Jonathan has some slides, so we'll make those available in PDF format. And you should receive an email with the link to the recording in the next few days. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Matt.
All right, thank you, Mark. So since this webinar is a little bit different from the last time that the Census Bureau put on a presentation, since we have John here from sort of an external data user standpoint and to talk about the Minnesota Population Center's experience with the summary file. I'm just here to give a brief background into the summary file, what changes were made, why those changes were made. So in the chat, you should see a link to this GitHub page, which is our wiki page for the summary file for the new format. In this, I'll just be briefly going over this background section. This is our primary documentation for the new summary file, and it has all references related to the new summary file format as well. So just briefly, and if you were at our last webinar last year, this is going to look very familiar. Why did we make a change from what is now the current summary file format to a new format? So the reason is simple. It's because it's extremely complicated, both for data users and ACS census staff to create and verify these data. So if you look at this image here that was shown last time, we produced over 140,000 files every year for the summary file in support of the summary file. You can see how we split those files up into multiple files based on their state, based on if the sequences, estimates, MOEs, and 1 and 5 year. So that all adds up. So 10,000 foot view, the proposed change would take, I'm just going to go over the images here, and you can all look at the details of this on our GitHub page if you like. But basically, in a screenshot, which this is also on our ACS webpage, but here we can see it a little bit more clearly. It's a picture of what our current summary file looks like if we open up all the folders and zip files. So this is, basically that 140,000 files, a summary of those and how they're broken up into different ways. So this format was designed in the 90s, when we were still using floppy disks and memory was at a premium. So we decided to propose this new format where it's table-based, so that every file is based on a table. So this is an example for 2018 5-year data. And then we also have the geographies and the labels to support that data. If we scroll down a little further, we can see the example of the current format. And this is sourced from our user handbook for the summary file. And we can see in red the logical record number, which is a lookup number for the geography, and then the sequence number 0038 used for the table lookup. So these data, there are multiple lookups to determine what these data represent here. And then if we scroll down a little further, we can see the new format and what that looks like. So directly, we can see the table, the line number, whether it's an estimate margin of error, and also what geography this applies for. So using the geographic labels, we can get the labels for those directly as well. So that's the reasons we made the change, sort of make it more simple for data users and the Bureau. Say a few recent updates I'll just go into is that we look back at the overview here. We do have other notable changes for the new format, as well as example code for the summary file in SAS and Python. So Python is most recent code. There have been requests for other languages, examples for other languages, and we do plan to add more languages as we gain support for the new format. Also, if you're interested in contributing code, please just contact us on the Slack workspace. There's an invite here for that, as well as you can feel free to add an issue here and communicate with us that way. I think there are open issues right now for those, for at least the R language. And I'll just briefly touch on some of these geography notes. So, for example, we have the example for how we match the geography here, the data with the geography. And this is just saying, just taking the GeoID and mapping it to what we're now calling dad's ID, which will change in the future. And some other notes there for data and the variables. So that's an overview of what the change is, why we made the change, and some recent updates and what we're doing with the summary file. I'll now pass it back over to John from the Minnesota Population Center for his experience using the summary file.
Great. Thanks very much, Matt. John, I am now passing the torch to you.
Okay. You can see my screen?
I can.
Okay. Just a second. Let me try to, I'm seeing a big image of myself right now. I need to hide that. There we go. Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to share our perspective. I have to say we have a really unique perspective as a disseminator of summary file data. I imagine the general audience is probably more interested in how they could access the summary file data for their organization, to have data to analyze for their particular organization's needs or for their research projects. We don't have that general use case in mind. What we do at IPPMS and at NHGIS specifically, where I spend most of my time, is we take the summary file data and we redistribute it. We make it easier to use. But this year, with the 2025 year data, this was the first time we imported data from the ACS summary files via the new summary file format. So we do have experience using it, and I'm happy to talk today about our experience. So what I want to do in order to present this is first spend like the first half of my discussion just presenting what we do with summary file data in NHGIS so that you have a better idea of what our needs are. And then after that, I'll talk specifically about our experience working with the new summary file. So the background is that NHGIS stands for the National Historical Geographic Information System. This is a project that's been around for about 20 years now. We initially had a focus on bringing in historical summary file data and data from before summary files even existed, and providing it all through a uniform website that would provide you access to everything. But we got into the business of continuing to update that data set to include all of the newest data. So even though this project predates the ACS, we have added 5-year data from every 5-year period of the ACS up through the present. We provide both summary tables and GIS files so that you can produce maps like those that you see here. And we go all the way back to 1790. So another big advantage of NHGIS that I want to point out is that we provide all of our data in nationwide extents, with the exception of our block level GIS data, which is only available for specific states. Everything else you can get for a full nation. So if you're interested in, full nationwide tract or block group data from the ACS, you could get that from us in a single download and a single request. We are also principally funded by NSF and NIH grants, which means that we can provide all of our data and products to you for free. We merely require that you register and agree to cite us and not redistribute the data without permission. In order to show you what is available and how we repackage summary file data, I'll just walk you through our website. This is the main page for NHGIS, nhgis.org. And here in the middle of that page is a button you can click on to get data. I'm just going to take a second to check the chat here and make sure there's, okay, yep, I saw a little blinking light over on the side and want to make sure there was nothing new coming in. So if you click on that button, you'll come to our data finder, and this is our web access system. So this is an equivalent application to data.census.gov or its predecessors, the American Fact Finders, the 1 and 2. There were a couple different versions of American Fact Finder. What we have on our site is the ability first to filter, as you would up here. So when you, sorry, my slide advancement is a little twitchy. For whatever reason, when I'm sharing my screen, I'm unable to advance my slides with my arrow keys on my keyboard, and instead I can only use the scroll wheel on my mouse, which gets a little twitchy. I apologize for that. When you have selected a topic or a filter, and in this case I have used a topic filter for educational attainment, You will then see which data tables are available on our system. And initially you'll see there are 3 different types of data. And under the source tables, that's where we show the basic tables that were available in our original source data sets with some adjustments. But here you can see this goes all the way back to 1880. We have some data about educational attainment. And I can then sort by popularity to see what other NHGIS users have most downloaded. And you'll see what comes to the top are recent ACS 5-year periods. 2025 year is not yet surpassed 2019 according to our popularity metric, but it's rising quickly. We've only had it out for just over a month now. And you can see there's several different table names here, different tables from the summary file. If I want to learn more about any of these tables, I can't actually see the data within this application. It's not like data.census.gov in that regard. You can't see the data, you can only select it and download it, but you can learn more about it. If you click on one of these links, I can see exactly which variables are available for a given summary table. And over to the right, I can also see which specific categories are used in the cross tabulation. This is a value added that we do in NHGIS. We pull out the different dimensions of a cross tabulation, so both the sex categories and the educational attainment categories, and allow you to just focus in on, well, what is the list, this list, so that you could then compare it to other tables. You could click on, on the dataset link to learn more about each of our different ACS data sets or other data sets. We also, just trying to use my scroll wheel without sliding all over the place here, not very easily. We also have the option of seeing the breakdowns, what we call breakdowns, what is called in the ACS, the geographic components, are separate divisions of geography for which you can get separate counts at some levels of geography. So in ACS summary files, it is possible to get every table just for urban population or just for rural population, etc., at some levels, at the nation level, sometimes at the state level, region, division levels. But here you can see what those different options are. As we move across to different data types, you can see we also have time series tables, and these tables, we at NHGIS have identified consistent concepts in counts across time. So you can actually get a table of educational attainment counts back to 1970. Right now, these tables only include 2 ACS 5-year periods, the 2012 5-year and the 2019 5-year. We are working on including all ACS 5-year periods, which we hope to do later this year at some point, including the most recent 2025 year. We also have GIS files, so you can select those also through the same interface. In this case, I've sorted by popularity, so you can see our most popular GIS files that have educational attainment available through corresponding tables. Our census tract files for 2019, 2020, 2010, and then down to county, and we have GIS files down to the block level. So, sorry, a little glitchy again. The next thing I wanted to show is what if I specifically want block group data and only for the 2025 year ACS. I can select some additional filters here. So I'm only looking at block group data and I'm only looking at this 5-year period. And now you can see the tables that fulfill those requirements. One thing that's unique about NHGIS is that within this interface, we do not keep track of which tables have specific summary levels available. We do it not at the table level, but at the data set level. Our system has an assumption that for a given data set, there is a specific set of summary levels for which you can get all of the tables. And because of that, we end up breaking up the ACS 5-year summary file into 4 different data sets. ACS 5A is our data set that includes tables that go down to the block group level. So I've selected these filters. If I now go into the data sets filter pop-up, I will see most of these options are grayed out. That's because most of these options have no data that correspond to my other filter selections. I selected the 2016 to 2020 period, so that's in here. And I selected block group level data, which grays out these 3 other types of data that come from the summary file. ACS 5B is our data set that includes data tables that go down to the tract level. ACS 5C includes only those tables that summarize by residence 1 year ago, and ACS 5D by place of work. And that's each of those different sets of tables have a different standard set of summary levels available. So that's somewhat useful for a user so that you can very quickly identify which tables do go down to block group level. As it is with ACS summary file documentation, that information is available through an Excel file that's on the website for summary files, some appendices that are available that actually tell you which tables are available down to the block group level, but it's not available sort of at the point of sale. When people want to go and get the summary file data, it's not always immediately obvious. I'm not quite sure how data.census.gov is handling this right now. With the bulk summary files that we're talking about in this webinar, the way you would find it out is only by opening a file for a given table and determining whether there are any records in that file for a given summary level. So you would actually have to inspect the summary level codes in a file and then determine whether any of those codes are matching the block group level. And that's something that we have to do when we bring this data into NHGIS. We have to inspect those files to determine exactly which levels are available in each of them, so that we can then group the tables together in each of these 4 data sets. Just so you know, if you click on any of the green text here, you could learn more about our data set groups, what we call data set groups. So the 2020 American Community Survey is one of our data set groups. And if you pop this up, it provides more information about how we split it up. And it also has another note that I wanted to share, that we do not provide the 2020 1-year experimental data tables through NHGIS, mainly because they're much more limited than the typical 1-year summary file releases in the number of tables and in the summary levels covered. I think it's only nation and state level, which is a fairly limited set compared to other NHGIS data sets. So we haven't tried to ingest that into our system yet. Another way that tables vary in their summary level coverage, though, is more idiosyncratic. So in the ACS summary files, there are a handful of tables that are available for a much smaller set of levels. So for example, this detailed race table in the 2019 ACS 1-year data is available only at the nation level. It's very detailed. It goes down to 69 different race categories. And for that reason, it's limited in its geographic coverage. Now, this square bracketed text is something that we added to that label to let our users know that if you select this table for, say, census tracts, or I guess ACS summary, ACS 1-year data doesn't have tract data. If you selected it for the place level, you would get no data. If you selected it for the state level, you would get no data. And we try to indicate that within this label. So that's another reason why we have to inspect all of the summary file data to make sure that we have a record of which levels are available for which tables, and then we include that in these descriptors. So some more examples of that. In these other tables, sometimes they're available nation and state and county levels, or just the nation and state levels. Sometimes they're quite idiosyncratic. Some of them are available for combined statistical areas or for congressional districts. And sometimes also there are limitations in whether data are available for Puerto Rico or for only Puerto Rico. And usually that is indicated in the table label title. So a lot of ACS table labels will say for Puerto Rico or for the US. And then you can tell that it would only cover the US or only Puerto Rico. But there are a couple tables like these where we had to add square bracketed text to indicate that this table is specifically not for Puerto Rico. So we also inspect whether there is Puerto Rico data in a given summary table. There's another unique thing that you can't even determine from the appendices. The appendices from the summary file will only tell what the intentional range of coverage is. So whether a table is meant to include block group level data or not. But there are some tables, especially in the ACS 1 year, where because of suppression, because of the lack of adequate data, there is no data provided, or a much smaller set of levels provided than is documented in the appendix. And so for this particular set of tables, there is absolutely no summary level data available, despite the fact that the table exists in this summary file. So what we have done with these is we add a square bracketed note that says no data for this time period. Again, we do this thorough inspection. A couple other things: when you download data from NHGIS, you work through this our web page, and you get to this page where you can select the exact format that you'd like for your data. You have an option to include an additional descriptive header row. And when we include that additional header row, we try to include labels that fully describe each variable. And that means that we include each category that identifies that variable. So for example, males without a high school degree and females without a high school degree, we want to list both of those categories in the variable label. Now, some sources of summary file documentation, the main sources that are available through the website, do not concatenate all of those labels together. Instead, what you'll see is a list of every category that is used in that table, where it's arranged hierarchically, so that you'll see, okay, first male, and then all of the educational levels, and then female, and then all of the educational levels. And it is a difficulty, it has been a difficulty for us to combine those categories together because they're not presented that way in the summary file documentation. They are presented that way in the API. And so of late, for a few years now, we've been getting our variable labels from the API instead of from the summary file documentation. Additionally, there's this option to either combine breakdowns and data types into a single data file or separate them into different data files. And what the breakdown is like the spatial components, geographic components that I identified before, urban and rural. You could get those in separate files or together in one file. But the data type is also the estimates versus the margins of error. In our database, our internal database, we store those in separate files, estimates and margins of error. They are completely parallel to one another. For every estimate, there's a margin of error, so we can bring those together in a single data file, or we can deliver them separately if you choose. But that also means that we need to be able to pull those apart, which I'll come back to in a minute. So just to summarize, some of the unique things that NHGIS needs in pulling summary file data into our system. Sorry, a little jumpiness in my scroll again. We need all summary file tables. Okay, so that includes both, and we need data and metadata for all of those tables. That might be a unique case. A lot of users may only have interest in particular tables or particular summary levels. We pull in all of it. And I have to say, like, the summary files, the bulk summary files that we're talking about in this webinar are a really useful source for that. It is extremely beneficial to have that all packaged in one place where we can download it in bulk, as opposed to selecting specific tables or specific states or counties of data. We get it all in one place, and that's been really useful. We also have needs for specific types of metadata, we need to know the relationship between each table and which summary levels are available, and whether it covers both the US and Puerto Rico, or just one or the other. And we need, at some point, complete variable labels and the label components. So it is useful for us to have a list of just the educational attainment variables or categories, because we actually pull those out and present those separately from the sex categories or the age categories, etc. So we need both of those things. It also is helpful if we can easily separate each of the different summary levels. In our system, we package the different summary levels separately, which has always been different from how the bulk summary files are available. In a original summary file, all of the summary levels are listed in a single table, and each record can provide data for a different summary level. For NHGIS, we actually pull all those records apart so that we keep the block groups in one place, the tracts in another place, the counties and states and nations, nation level data in separate files, and you can request them in separate files. Similarly, we pull out the different geographic components, urban, rural, metropolitan areas, and keep those in separate files. We also separate, as I mentioned, estimates and margins of error. So, how did the new summary file format suit our needs? Before I answer that, I want to credit the people who helped me prepare these notes. Our team here at NHGIS, there's several different people who work on bringing ACS data into NHGIS. We had a larger team this year because we have, this year we completely redesigned how we're bringing the data in. We took this opportunity because we were going to ingest the new format of summary files. We also took the opportunity to upgrade our general process and had a bunch of people involved. So I wanted to credit these people. I met with them prior to this presentation to get their feedback as well. Overall, the entire team feels that the new summary file format is a very welcome change. We really appreciate the simplicity of the new design. We found it was easier to understand and work with. The structure of it is very well, well determined. Each file corresponds to a table, and everything you need related to that table is in that file. All of the geographic levels are there. They're not separated into separate files. And multiple tables aren't combined into separate files the way that the original summary file format works. So the new format provides clarity about the relationship between columns and tables. Which columns go with which tables? Well, all of the columns in a given file go with that file's table. Also, every file can contain all of the summary levels. We don't have some files for tracts and block groups, some for state level or higher, and just the variations that used to exist no longer exist. So, issues that the feedback we wanted to provide on some changes that caused us more problems than the previous format. The new way of handling margins of error is a bit of a problem for us. Now, the new summary file format interleaves the estimates and margins of error columns. So for each estimate, you'll have a column, and then immediately a margin of error column, and then the next estimate, and then the next margin of error column. The problem with that structure for us is it makes it significantly harder to just pull those separate columns apart. And I expect for a lot of data analysts, this could also be a problem too. If you want to sum up multiple age categories, you just want to sum up the estimates. And in this new format, that means summing up non-consecutive columns instead of consecutive columns. And there's just some efficiencies in being able to work with consecutive columns instead of non-consecutive columns. I expect the reason why it's structured this way is because this is how the data is presented in data.census.gov. For each estimate in data.census.gov, you will see the corresponding margin of error immediately adjacent. And that is useful, but it is more problematic for a bulk data process. Another problem is that some tables have no margins of error columns. So for a given file, most files have M columns for margins of error, but you might open up a file and discover there are no M columns. This is a problem for our bulk processing. It is easier for us to assume that all of the estimate columns are grouped together separately from the margins of error, and it is easier for us to assume that every estimate has a corresponding margin column. Even if it's blank, it's just easier to know. We don't have to specially program to check to see whether there's a margin of error column there. We can just grab it. We can assume it's there and just grab it. So it would be nice if there was always a margin of error column, even if it's blank, or failing that, it would be nice to have a better indication of which tables lack the margins of error column so that we can operate on that and determine without having to inspect the files ourselves. Sorry, jumping this again. So it's somewhat easier to, somewhat harder now to determine each table's summary levels covered and areas covered. And that's because they're all packaged in one big file. Now, there's an advantage to that, but it used to be that we could just look in the tracks and block groups set to determine whether there were block groups there. Now we have to look at an entire set, and we have to inspect a larger set of rows to see whether Puerto Rico is included. This wouldn't be as important if there weren't also issues with Appendix A, where these geographic restrictions are reported. The problems with Appendix A is that we have not found it consistently thorough. It provides a lot of information about geographic restrictions, but it cannot be relied on for every type of geographic restriction. They're not always reported there. This is designed for human reading, and it is liable to human error. So those who have put it together have not, to our knowledge, done an automated inspection of every single summary file table to ensure that there is complete consistency between Appendix A and the actual summary files. So what we recommend, and this is really for the original summary file format as well as the new, it would be great if the Census Bureau could auto-generate a machine-readable matrix of which levels and which areas are covered by each table so that users don't have to inspect the files to determine this themselves. Another problematic change is that there is currently a lot of inconsistency in how geographic ID fields are identified based on what content they include. The geo_ID field that now appears in the new summary file data files and on data.census.gov includes multiple components that also appear in this DADS ID in the geography file. Those components do not appear in the GeoID in the geography file. And none of those extra components appear in the GeoID and TigerLine shape files. So there are actually 3 different versions of GeoID at the moment. As I understand, DADS ID will go away, and the new GeoID will probably be consistent across these things, but it will still, as I understand, not be consistent with the GeoID and the TigerLine shape file. So I would highly recommend that Census looks into providing a consistent identifier across all of these data file types, including the TigerLine shape files, because it's important to have a common field to be able to join the data with the boundaries, and use a consistent naming. So if there's going to be a difference between some GeoIDs, including summary level codes and geographic component codes, and other geographic IDs not including that, I would recommend that we come up with a different name for these things. All right, I should probably move on. I know I've been taking up a lot of time here. I'm sorry about that. So I'll move right on. Some quick points. We would appreciate a more consistent and updated character encoding. A common standard today is UTF-8. The summary files continue to use, as I understand, Latin 1. This has already caused problems for the API because the API tries to present information through using UTF-8, but in the process, it actually accidentally converted Latin 1 to UTF-8 twice which meant going beyond UTF-8 and producing nonsense characters. So that's a problem. We'd like to see more sharing of metadata between and types of information between the API and the summary files. There's useful things that we can get from one that we can't get from the other. So for example, from the API, we can get fully concatenated variable names, which is useful. From the summary file docs, we can get complete table metadata and universes, which you can't get from the API, as I understand. You can get an ordered variable listing. The variable listing in the API is unordered, sort of randomly ordered. And we can find in the appendices these geographic restrictions, which are not readily available from the API either. A couple more points. The new ACS summary file data files are pipe delimited, which is good. It's a nice delimiter. They're not used in labels very often, so it makes for a good delimitator. But the geography file still uses commas. So let's just go complete. I would suggest go all the way. Just use pipe delimited for everything, including for some of the Excel docs, like the appendices that could be more machine readable if they were just simply provided in pipe delimited files. The widths of the geocodes is a useful thing to know. So how wide is a place code, or how wide is a county code? That information is currently provided in the summary file technical documentation PDF file, but that is the only place where I've ever found this. And so it'd be helpful to have that in a more machine readable format. Something to suggest going forward is that traditionally the summary file geographic file has included several large blank columns. I assume because it was a fixed width format, so you wanted to preserve some space to include additional, potentially include additional geographic codes in the future. Those shouldn't be necessary now that we're going to a pipe delimited format, so you might drop those. And the last point here is that our developers found it somewhat a hassle to try to get the data off of an FTP site as compared to getting data through the API. So now it's possible you could have an API endpoint that delivers whole summary files rather than an FTP site. Perhaps consider that as well. Okay, so I'll wrap up with some acknowledgments here, and thank you for sticking with me. I'm sorry I went a little long. I hope there's time to answer all your questions now.
Great, thanks very much, Jonathan. We have a little more than 15 minutes, and I guess before we do have some questions that have come in, and I guess before we get to those, I wanted to see if Matt, if you had any responses to any of the questions, concerns that Jonathan raised at the end of his presentation.
Okay, sure, Mark. Yeah, thanks, John, for your thorough evaluation and using the new format with your team. Yeah, I agree with some of these improvements, and I have gotten a chance to look over the issues you raised. The good news is that some of the issues are planned already to be changed this year. So, for example, the universe being in the API, sharing data from what's only available now in FTP to the API. So we've worked with the data.census.gov team, and they are planning to make that universe available in the API this year. So thankfully, it's taken us a while, but finally that's being changed. So yeah, that was a good catch. Yeah, about GID and DADS ID, we're basing that on internal changes as well. So that, I believe, should be changed this year as well, and more consistent. I don't know about that matching the Tiger shapefile GUIDs, unfortunately, but yeah, I'll definitely take a look. That's always been something that's a little bit outside of our box that we can't necessarily control, but I'll take a look to see if there's any way we could match that better. Yeah, the other issues like for the FTP versus HTTP, I don't know if this exactly answers, is a good response to that, but HTTP response, FTP has a mirror HTTP address, which is faster in some cases in downloading these files, and maybe more secure. Let's see if there's anything else. Yeah, so I'll be, we'll be evaluating this feedback as well, and implementing these changes. We also want to balance that out with not changing too many things. We want to make it consistent, as consistent as we can across the years, to not light anyone's systems on fire, but also make changes that are improvements and folks would enjoy. So yes, definitely appreciate this feedback, and we'll be evaluating all of these items moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Question from a data user. The current 2016 to 2020 ACS summary file is listed as a prototype on the Census Bureau's website, and she was wondering if we can expect any additional format changes for the upcoming 2017 to 2021 data, and will this be the only format going forward, I guess?
Yeah, that's probably the burning question for so many folks. And what I can say is that I think more messaging will come out from our communications area on this, but from what I've heard, that I'm able to say is that the new format will be the primary format this year. So be prepared for the new format as much as you can. And any other communications, I'll watch out for emails from our communications area on this one.
A question for you, Jonathan. Someone asked if they could save a set of geographies in the NHGIS Finder for later access, like similar to the bookmarks that you can create in data.census.gov.
No, not right now. We have an API, and we're working on additional R tools. So if you have a common need for coming back to our site and making requests of a similar type of data, you could check out our API so that you could write code basically that would always come back and request the same set of tables. Another thing that you can do is all of your past requests are saved, so you can always go back to a past request and revise it. So that would be an option as well.
Okay. Quick question, Jonathan. You mentioned the fact that some data don't have margins of error. Someone just wondered what that means. What's an example of a variable without a margin of error?
I think those are the tables that are technical variables, like the unweighted sample and allocation numbers that they're about the actual sampling and production of final estimates, so that margins of error don't actually apply to those.
And I think probably also those that are controlled to population estimates.
Yeah.
Population totals for certain geographic areas, for example, and broken down for certain groups. Yeah. Currently, the table shells are released several weeks before the data. Will this continue to be the case, Matt, with the new summary file format?
Yes. That will be released on the same schedule, if not try to get it out as early as you can, but at least on the same schedule.
Okay. And in some of the initial discussions about the summary file format, it was suggested that the table shells or some other internal documentation would include information about variable data type. Is that addition going to make it into any of the future iterations? This person mentions that would make working with the data a lot easier.
I guess not quite sure about that question. Does it mean like whether a variable is an estimate or margin of error or something like that?
Yeah, that I was not sure either what they meant by data type in this case, but
Could also be, text versus numeric versus floating point. It seems in most cases that's not an issue because they're mostly integers, or in the geographic file they're text. But I suppose there might be some cases where you do include decimal points or would. I'm not sure.
someone raised the concern that some tables will have more than 1,000 columns for combining estimates and margins of error, for example. And they mentioned table B24114 as an example. This is an issue they note for many systems. I think they probably mean things like Excel and most relational database systems. So it's not a question, but just something that somebody raised.
Yeah, it's as more than how many did you say, Mark?
They mentioned more than 1,000 columns for some tables.
More than 1,000. Okay, I didn't know we actually exceeded that, but that's a lot of columns. Maybe with the margins of errors, yeah, I could see that.
Yeah,
So we do have some that are maybe at 500 and then doubled. Yeah, that's a continual problem, and what we could do is either split that up into multiple tables, or we can just say, depending on which system you're using, you decide whether you want to split it up or not, right? I guess it wasn't really a question, it's more of a informational, but that's a definitely an issue. I also want to say you may have decimal places. That may be a really good point. I'll have to take that one back and take a look, because we want to first make sure that whatever we're doing is at least an improvement from the old format, and if there's a possibility that someone could ingest that data without knowing that, with removing a decimal point or something, it's a decrement to the accuracy. So I'll write that down here. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I want to point out there's one useful change that you're making with the new format is to use the new special codes that are used in the API rather than the older special codes and jam values that were used in the original summary file. The older codes included some text strings, and that was a problem we found for our users. We would strip those out because when you try to load those into some software packages, they convert numeric fields to text. The software will detect that, this special value is a text string, so therefore this column must be a text column. The new codes, I believe, are all numeric. They're negatives, and I think that's a good thing, so that that simplifies the reading of the summary file data into a lot of software programs, because it will preserve the numeric, preserve the columns as numeric.
Okay, great.
And we do have another participant who mentions that there definitely are columns with decimal data, and they note it would be very useful to have documentation on the data type, the number of decimal places, for example.
Yeah.
Someone else just wants to mention, Jonathan, that they agree with everything that you suggested, especially making the geography file consistent, using the same delimiter, removing the blank, or deduping those.
Great.
Let's see, if we have a list of table IDs like B01001, for example, how can we most easily use that to specify those tables for download? So if they know the table IDs, what's the easiest way to specify that those are the tables you want to download, I guess is the question.
Yeah, the way to answer that depends on which mechanism you're using to get the data. If you're using the NHGIS data finder, we unfortunately do not have a way to search by table code. We do have that ability through our API. I believe through the API, you are able to specify by table code. So that's an option. For the actual ACS summary file, that will be a lot easier now with the new summary file format, because as I recall, each file is labeled with its table code. Isn't that right, Matt?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question? I was looking through.
Well, someone asked how they would, if they had a list of table codes, how could they download the data for those tables? I think the table codes are embedded within the file names now, correct? For the new format?
Right.
So you would be able to select files that correspond to those tables based on their names.
Okay.
And I'll just add, I think afterwards we might have, after the recording, then we can open the microphone up so that if there's anything that can be clarified in the questions, then we can talk about that then as well.
Great. Yeah, there's just a couple more questions that have come in. Along the same lines of machine-readable documentation, we'd love to see machine-readable files of field labels like the table shells, but indicators of hierarchy or level. Or will the template files be provided for the new format, similar to the sequence file templates provided in Excel format?
Let me see here. Can you repeat? I'm trying to find this question on this modal here, but can you repeat that, Mark?
Yes, they're asking, similar to the machine-readable documentation, they'd like to see machine-readable files of field labels, like the table shells.
Oh, okay, I see indicators of hierarchy level. So yeah. I think I understand the question. Template be provided new format. Sequence file templates. So yeah, like, you know, right now we put out the table shells, but there's minimal indication of which lines are in a hierarchy above other lines. Yeah, I think the way we put out the table shells is in CSV format at the moment. Other than just make a call here. Yeah, that's something we'll have to take back and see if yeah, I know the API does have more of a hierarchy, but the way we have put out the table shells now, the assumption is that, you know, when those labels are actually used, folks aren't really using the entire label for different applications. So if they're seeing that label in context, then that's good enough to take that label and then kind of match it to what they're doing. So it depends. I mean, the API does have that more of a machine readable label, and you could match that up. But on the summary file, it's a little complicated for the summary file to, I mean, you know, if you just want a list of labels and to clearly see which label is which, then that hierarchy-driven label format. There's pros and cons to each, right? So I'd suggest the API labels if for any machine readable format. The table shells are more used, like you were saying, like human readable format for lookup, but can be also used for that direct lookup for the individual labels.
Okay.
So I'm interested in to hear what you're doing afterwards as well, and
okay. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. We do need to wrap this up, but as I said, if anybody wants to stick around, I think both Jonathan and Matt can stay on for a little bit. If people wanted to do so, we can have people unmute and just ask questions, have a conversation that way. I do want to thank both our panelists. I appreciate you taking the time to provide this update. And for the participants, thanks for joining. We will be sending a link to the recording in the next few days. And this concludes today's webinar. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you all.